Slaves you were, and slaves you remain.
A glimpse into the harrowing conditions faced by Roman slaves, the very foundation of the empire's economic and social might, reveals 15 of the most dire aspects of their existence, each more disturbing than the last. 1. Forced into slavery. The tale of a Roman slave often began with war. Many were prisoners of war, seized from the territories that Rome relentlessly expanded into. After a military campaign, it was not uncommon for thousands of the conquered to be transported back to Rome in chains. Once arrived, they were sold off to the highest bidder in crowded marketplaces, separated from families and stripped of their previous identities. Infants born to slaves were automatically consigned to the same life of servitude, with no hope or chance of freedom. Slave traders, often called mangones, would also procure slaves through kidnapping and piracy, ruthlessly exploiting any vulnerabilities. Wealthy Romans often preferred to buy young children or teenagers, as they could be more easily trained and indoctrinated to their master's liking. Not all slaves, however, were spoils of war or victims of kidnap. Debt slavery was a prevalent practice in the Roman Empire, where citizens who were unable to pay off their debts were relegated to a life of slavery. Their fate was no better than those captured in battle. In fact, the stark transition from Roman citizen to a mere piece of property was an even bitterer pill to swallow for many. Forced into servitude, these slaves were treated as objects rather than human beings, mere commodities to be traded, sold, and utilized as their masters saw fit. Their lives were marked with harsh labor, punishment, and complete lack of freedom. Every facet of their existence revolved around the whims and needs of their masters. But perhaps the most gruesome aspect of being forced into slavery was the psychological torment. These individuals were uprooted from their previous lives, separated from their loved ones, and thrust into a world of exploitation and humiliation. This constant fear and dehumanization had profound psychological effects, causing untold emotional distress. Thus, the life of a Roman slave was one of unending hardship and deprivation, starting with the grim process of being forced into slavery. Every subsequent ordeal was a cruel testament to the sheer indifference and brutality that characterized their existence. This encapsulates the horrifying reality of being a slave in the powerful and prosperous Roman Empire. 2. Harsh punishments and brutality. Living under the absolute power of their masters, Roman slaves were often subjected to harsh punishments and physical brutality. The Roman law considered slaves as property, not as individuals. Therefore, masters had the legal right to treat their slaves as they wished, which often resulted in brutal punishment for perceived or actual disobedience. Flogging was a common form of punishment for slaves, carried out with a whip made of leather strips, often embedded with pieces of bone or metal to inflict maximum pain. Slaves could be flogged for any reason, from failing to complete a task to simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The severity of the flogging often depended on the master's mood and the nature of the perceived offense. The scars from these whippings would often mark a slave for life, serving as a constant, painful reminder of their status and the brutality they endured. In addition to flogging, Roman slaves were subjected to other forms of physical torture. For more serious offenses, slaves could be branded, often on the forehead, with marks that identified them as fugitives or criminals. The branding iron, heated till it glowed red, was a potent symbol of a master's total control over the slave's body and life. For the most severe transgressions, Roman slaves could be sentenced to death. Masters had the legal right to execute their slaves without trial. The methods of execution were as brutal as they were varied. Crucifixion, being thrown to wild animals, or being forced to fight to the death in the gladiatorial arena were among the most horrifying. Yet, the harsh punishments and brutality didn't stop at physical abuse. Slaves also faced emotional and psychological torment. Public humiliation was a commonplace aspect of a slave's life. They were often made to wear distinctive clothing to distinguish them from free Romans, and were regularly subjected to degrading tasks or performances in front of their master's guests. The psychological impact of this constant degradation was immense, leading to feelings of hopelessness, fear, and deep-seated trauma. Even the specter of punishment was a powerful tool in the hands of the masters who used it to control and manipulate their slaves. Fear of punishment was a constant companion for Roman slaves, casting a long, distressing shadow over their daily lives. Every task carried the risk of failure, and every failure carried the risk of brutal reprisal. The harsh punishments and brutalities inflicted on Roman slaves served as a stark reminder of their status as chattel. Their lives were dictated by their masters' whims, under the constant threat of physical harm, psychological torment, and the chilling prospect of a brutal death. The painful existence of a Roman slave was shaped by these everyday brutalities, reflecting a society that was structured around violence and oppression. 3. Slavery and the Roman economy. In the Roman Empire, slaves were not only an integral part of the social fabric, but also a critical component of the economy. Indeed, the economic structure of Rome was heavily reliant on the work and exploitation of slaves. From agriculture and mining to domestic service and entertainment, slaves were ubiquitous in all spheres of economic activity. The rural economy of Rome was primarily based on vast farming estates known as latifundia. These enormous properties, often owned by the elite, were almost entirely operated by slaves. These individuals toiled under harsh conditions to cultivate grains, olives, and grapes, which were vital to the Roman economy. The profits derived from these plantations contributed significantly to the wealth of the Roman elite and provided the empire with much-needed sustenance. In the urban setting, slaves were employed in a myriad of occupations. They were artisans, craftsmen, cooks, cleaners, and even doctors and teachers. Skilled slaves were highly valued and contributed significantly to the economy. Despite their skills, they received no remuneration for their labor. Instead, the fruits of their toil went straight into their masters' pockets. Slavery was also critical to the Roman mining industry. Slaves were made to labor in dreadful conditions in the mines, extracting valuable resources like silver, gold, and lead. This brutal labor often resulted in shortened lifespans due to the harsh working conditions and frequent accidents. Yet the profits garnered from these mines boosted Rome's economy and funded its military might. Furthermore, the trading of slaves constituted a thriving industry within the Roman economy. The demand for slaves in various capacities meant that slave traders, known as mangones, could amass considerable wealth. This trade also facilitated economic interactions with other regions and peoples, as slaves were often sold and transported across great distances. Moreover, the unpaid labor of slaves allowed Roman citizens and the elite to engage in leisure or political activities, thereby contributing to societal stability and the functioning of the state. The system of slavery essentially subsidized the Roman economy, allowing it to maintain its military dominance and extensive public works. In effect, the Roman economy was deeply entrenched in the institution of slavery. The brutal exploitation of slaves facilitated economic prosperity for the free citizens of Rome at the expense of the enslaved. From the fields to the city, from the mines to the marketplace, the shackles of slavery were an inescapable reality. This highlights the deeply disturbing nature of the Roman economy, which, in its pursuit of wealth and prosperity, upheld and perpetuated an institution as abhorrent as slavery. 4. The degradation of humanity. The institution of slavery in Rome was not merely an economic or social construct, it was a systemic degradation of humanity, a stripping away of personhood that reduced individuals to the status of property. Under Roman law, slaves were considered res, things or objects, rather than personae, persons. This legal and social dehumanization of slaves permeated every aspect of their lives, marking their existence with untold misery and suffering. The process of dehumanization began from the very moment individuals were enslaved. Whether through war, piracy, or debt, those destined for slavery were instantly transformed from free individuals with rights and identities into mere commodities, ready to be bought, sold, and used at their master's whims. This immediate and complete erasure of their previous existence was a cruel testament to the extreme devaluation of their humanity. Roman slaves had no legal identity or rights. They could not enter into contracts, own property, or marry in the legal sense. Any children born to slaves were the property of their mother's masters, effectively negating any familial bonds. This absence of legal recognition served to further dehumanize slaves, denying them the basic human rights and societal structures that were crucial for personal dignity and self-worth. Emotionally and psychologically, the experience of Roman slaves was characterized by constant humiliation and fear. They lived at the mercy of their masters, subjected to physical brutality, sexual abuse, and intense labor. This ongoing trauma, coupled with the persistent threat of punishment or sale, resulted in severe emotional distress and the internalization of their inferior status. Moreover, the public degradation of slaves, whether in the form of harsh punishments or demeaning tasks, further entrenched their dehumanized status. The Roman society, by openly accepting and engaging in the humiliation of slaves, effectively normalized their objectification. This public dehumanization served not only to control and intimidate slaves, but also to uphold the social order by clearly demarcating the boundaries between slave and free. The institution of slavery in Rome was a profound degradation of humanity. It stripped individuals of their identities, rights, and dignity, reducing them to the level of objects to be used, traded, and discarded at will. The life of a Roman slave was marked by this constant dehumanization, a daily testament to the extreme disparity of power and worth within the Roman society. This reality offers a chilling perspective on the depths to which human cruelty and indifference can descend when other human beings are regarded as mere property. 5. Sexual abuse and exploitation. In the deeply hierarchical society of ancient Rome, slaves were often subjected to sexual abuse and exploitation. Both male and female slaves were victims, bearing the brunt of their master's whims and lust. This aspect of Roman slavery was perhaps one of the most insidious and traumatic, adding yet another layer of degradation and torment to a slave's life. As slaves were legally considered property, masters had complete authority over them, including their sexuality. This power imbalance created a situation where sexual abuse was not only prevalent, but also tacitly accepted. Female slaves were frequently used for sexual gratification by their masters, a deeply horrifying facet of their existence. Male slaves were also not exempt, with many being exploited by both their male and female masters. Moreover, some slaves, known as delicatae, were specifically procured and groomed for sexual purposes, often sold at a premium in the slave markets. The lives of these slaves were particularly tragic, their entire existence centered around their sexual exploitation. 6. Physical and mental strains. Roman slaves faced tremendous physical and mental strains as part of their everyday lives. Physically, the hard labor they were forced into, whether in the fields, mines, or households, often led to exhaustion, injuries, and even premature death. The harsh working conditions, inadequate nutrition, and lack of medical care further compounded these physical challenges. In addition to physical labor, slaves were also tasked with running their masters' households, requiring them to work long hours with minimal rest. This constant exertion, combined with the ever-present threat of punishment, led to physical strain and deteriorating health. Mentally, the condition of being a slave was profoundly distressing. The loss of freedom, the constant fear of punishment, the degradation, and the sexual abuse led to severe psychological trauma. Slaves lived in a state of constant fear and uncertainty, leading to conditions like anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Furthermore, the separation from family and loved ones added to the emotional strain on slaves. The inability to form stable, lasting relationships due to the threat of sale or transfer could result in feelings of isolation and despair. The physical and mental strains faced by Roman slaves were a continual reminder of their cruel and inhumane existence. 7. Lack of legal rights. Slaves in Rome were not recognized as citizens and were therefore bereft of legal rights. They were considered property rather than people, giving their owners complete control over their lives. This lack of legal protection was a significant element of the plight of Roman slaves. Slaves could not enter into legal contracts or initiate legal proceedings. They were unable to own property, despite their ability to amass personal possessions or peculium, which legally belonged to their masters. Additionally, slaves were not permitted to legally marry, and any children born to slaves automatically inherited the status of a slave from their mother. While Roman law did provide certain protections for slaves, these were often ignored or inadequately enforced. For instance, the Lex Patronia law ostensibly prohibited masters from sending slaves to fight wild beasts in the arena without a magistrate's sanction. However, the effectiveness of such laws was questionable at best. The testimony of slaves in legal matters was also subject to limitations. While slaves could testify in trials, their testimony was only admissible if obtained under torture, on the belief that they would only tell the truth under duress. This created a system where slaves were not only deprived of their legal rights, but were also subjected to extreme brutality in the process. 8. Inadequate living conditions. The living conditions of Roman slaves varied based on their role and their master's wealth. However, across the board, many faced inadequate and often deplorable living conditions. The vast majority of slaves lived in cramped, squalid quarters, often in the basements or attics of their master's home. Rural slaves, who worked in the fields and on plantations, often resided in barrack-like structures, with little to no privacy. These living spaces were typically overcrowded, unsanitary, and poorly ventilated. Similarly, urban slaves, despite living in more affluent surroundings, were often confined to small, uncomfortable spaces. Slaves also suffered from inadequate nutrition. Their diet was often low in quality and quantity, consisting of cheap grains, vegetables, and occasionally small amounts of meat. Poor nutrition, coupled with harsh physical labor, often resulted in weakened health and susceptibility to disease. The lack of basic sanitation and medical care further worsened their living conditions. Slaves were frequently denied access to medical treatment, leading to high mortality rates. Their living conditions, marked by deprivation and neglect, were a testament to their lowly status in Roman society, compounding the many hardships they already endured. 9. Gladiatorial combat and slavery. One of the more gruesome and terrifying aspects of Roman slavery was the use of slaves as gladiators. While some gladiators were free men who voluntarily entered the profession, a significant number were slaves purchased specifically for their combat potential or slaves sentenced to the arena as punishment. These gladiatorial slaves underwent rigorous and brutal training in specialized schools, or ludi, where they were taught to fight, often to the death, for the entertainment of the Roman public. The lives of these individuals were marked by violence, fear, and uncertainty. Every time they stepped into the arena, they faced the very real possibility of death. Gladiatorial games were a popular form of entertainment in Rome, often sponsored by the wealthy as a display of their power and generosity. However, behind this spectacle lay the horrific reality of slaves being forced to fight for their lives for the amusement of others. This aspect of Roman slavery speaks volumes about the disregard for human life and the extent of the power imbalance between master and slave. 10. Children and slavery. Children were not exempt from the horrors of Roman slavery. Children could be born into slavery if their mother was a slave, regardless of their father's status. They could also be sold into slavery or captured during wars and raids. The life of a child slave in Rome was particularly tragic. They were often exploited for their small size, made to do tasks such as cleaning small spaces or being employed in textile industries where their small fingers were considered beneficial. Child slaves were also used for entertainment, forced to perform for the amusement of their masters and their guests. Education for slave children was a luxury reserved for those serving wealthy households, where they were often used as personal attendants for their masters' children. However, this proximity to free children did not alter their status, but rather reinforced their servitude. Children slaves were subjected to the same harsh treatment as adult slaves, including physical and sexual abuse. The physical and psychological impact of such experiences at a young age was undoubtedly devastating, further highlighting the horrific nature of Roman slavery. 11. The life of household slaves. Household slaves, or servi, were a common feature of Roman homes, particularly those of the wealthier citizens. They performed a myriad of domestic tasks, ranging from cooking, cleaning, and serving meals to personal services such as grooming, nursing, and childcare. While the life of a household slave may seem less harsh compared to those in the mines or fields, it was nonetheless marked by subjugation and hardship. Household slaves worked long hours, often from dawn till dusk, with minimal rest. Their tasks, while less physically demanding, were often repetitive and menial, emphasizing their inferior status. Household slaves were constantly under their master's watchful eye, subjected to their whims and tempers. Physical punishment for perceived misbehavior was common, instilling fear and maintaining control. Sexual exploitation of household slaves was also prevalent, adding another layer of trauma and abuse. Despite the hardships, some household slaves could gain a modicum of favor or status within the household, particularly those who held positions such as steward or nanny. However, this did not change their fundamental status as property or shield them from the potential cruelty of their masters. 12. Condemned to the mines, worst of all fates. If being a slave in Rome was a cruel fate, then being a slave condemned to work in the mines was perhaps the worst of all fates. These slaves, often criminals or war captives, were forced to work in grueling conditions, extracting precious metals and minerals that contributed to Rome's wealth and prosperity. Life in the mines was characterized by extreme hardship. The work was physically demanding, involving long hours of digging and hauling in poorly lit, unsafe environments. Accidents were common, as were respiratory diseases due to the constant inhalation of dust and fumes. Living conditions for mining slaves were equally deplorable. They were often chained to prevent escape and lived in crude, overcrowded barracks. The lack of proper nutrition and medical care further exacerbated their suffering. Death was a constant companion for these mining slaves, either through exhaustion, disease, or cave-ins. Their lives were expendable, their value tied solely to the wealth they extracted from the earth. The harsh reality of life in the mines serves as a stark reminder of the extreme brutality and inhumanity of Roman slavery. 13. Social stigma and isolation. The life of a Roman slave was not only physically and psychologically challenging, but also socially isolating. Slaves were considered the lowest rung of Roman society, a status that carried significant social stigma. This stigma was perpetuated by various societal mechanisms, such as laws and customs, that clearly demarcated the line between slaves and free citizens. For instance, slaves were required to wear specific clothing or markings to denote their status. They were also forbidden from participating in certain social and religious events, furthering their marginalization. This public marking of slaves served to reinforce their inferior status and create a visible divide between them and the free population. Slaves also faced social isolation due to their lack of familial and community bonds. While slaves could form relationships with each other, these were often unstable due to the threat of separation by sale or transfer. The forced dissolution of families was a common occurrence in Roman slavery, leading to a profound sense of loss and disconnection. The isolation and stigma associated with being a slave compounded the many challenges they already faced, leading to feelings of despair and hopelessness. This social aspect of slavery offers another perspective on the complex and multidimensional nature of their suffering. 14. The rare, bleak hope of freedom. Freedom, or manumission, was the ultimate dream for many Roman slaves. However, this hope was often dim and uncertain, as manumission was entirely at the master's discretion and was generally a rare occurrence. Even when granted, freedom often came with strings attached. Some slaves were freed in their master's wills, a process known as testamentary manumission. Others could purchase their freedom using their savings or peculium, although this was a difficult and lengthy process. Certain professions, like the gladiators, could earn their freedom through exceptional performance or popularity. However, even upon gaining freedom, former slaves, or liberti, faced many challenges. They were often socially stigmatized and continued to have obligations towards their former masters, known as patronage. This system of patronage kept many former slaves economically and socially bound to their former masters. Additionally, liberti were often barred from certain professions and political participation. They remained at the margins of Roman society, their status as former slaves marking them as inferior. The bleak reality of freedom, riddled with lingering subjugation and discrimination, was often a bitter pill to swallow, making it a rare and tarnished hope for Roman slaves. 15. Slavery and religion. Spiritual suffering and solace. Religion played a significant role in the lives of Romans, and this extended to the realm of slavery. However, for slaves, religion was a complex and often painful aspect of their lives, marking yet another sphere of their existence, subject to control and manipulation by their masters. Roman slaves were required to participate in their masters' religious practices, which often included making sacrifices or performing other rituals in honor of the Roman gods. Slaves were also used in the ceremonies and festivals of the state religion, serving as attendants, performers, or sacrificial victims. This mandatory participation not only reinforced their subservience but also compromised their spiritual autonomy. The exploitation of slaves was also justified using religious beliefs. The prevalent ideology of the time viewed the gods as favoring the Romans, with their victories in war and their prosperity seen as divine endorsement of their practices, including slavery. This belief system served to legitimize and perpetuate the institution of slavery, making it a divinely sanctioned social order. On the other hand, religion also offered some solace to slaves. Many found comfort in their personal beliefs or turned to new religions that offered hope and equality. The spread of Christianity in the later periods of the Roman Empire was particularly appealing to slaves, as it preached a message of spiritual equality and promised eternal life to the downtrodden and oppressed. Furthermore, certain religious festivals, like the Saturnalia, temporarily inverted social norms, allowing slaves to participate in feasting and merriment, and even role reversals where they were served by their masters. While this provided a brief respite from their daily suffering, it ultimately reinforced their enslaved status once the festival ended. Therefore, religion was a double-edged sword for Roman slaves. On the one hand, it was a tool of control and justification for their harsh treatment. On the other hand, it offered them spiritual comfort and moments of reprieve in their otherwise bleak existence. This complex interplay between slavery and religion further highlights the multidimensional nature of the suffering experienced by Roman slaves.